$7 million of Italian carbon fiber and titanium. Dead as a brick. A team of factory engineers with diagnostic laptops couldn't wake it up. Then came a guy in oil-stained boots who hadn't slept a full night in 3 years. He didn't plug in a computer. He just closed his eyes, listened to the engine choke, and knew exactly where it hurt. Because when you spend your life trying to fix broken things, you learn how to listen. The air in sub-basement 4 smelled like ozone and expensive panic. Natalia stood with her arms crossed, her Manolo heels clicking a slow, impatient rhythm against the spotless epoxy floor. She was 41, the CEO of a logistics empire that moved half the freight on the eastern seaboard, and she was currently being defeated by a car. It wasn't just any car. It was a Mantova V12, a bespoke 1-of-9 hypercar built in a tiny shed in Modena. It was painted a matte obsidian that seemed to absorb the harsh fluorescent lights of the underground executive garage. It had a top speed of 230 miles an hour. Right now, its top speed was 0. "Explain it to me again, Greg," Natalia said. Her voice was flat. She didn't yell. Yelling was for people who had lost control. Natalia never lost control. Greg, the lead technician dispatched from the dealership, wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He was wearing a branded polo shirt that cost more than most people's car insurance. He was flanked by 2 other mechanics staring intently at ruggedized laptops wired into the Mantova's dashboard. "Ms. Hayes, the telemetry is green across the board," Greg stammered, tapping a finger against a screen, displaying a dizzying array of bar graphs and diagnostic codes. "The ECU is reporting optimal battery voltage. The immobilizer is disengaged. Fuel pressure sensors read normal. The car thinks it's ready to start." "And yet," Natalia said, gesturing vaguely at the silent machine, "it is not starting. I have a board meeting in 50 minutes. A meeting where I am expected to finalize a $4 billion acquisition. I drove down here to clear my head, and now I am trapped in a concrete bunker." "We can call a flatbed. It has 3 inches of ground clearance, Greg. We are 4 stories underground, at the bottom of a spiraling ramp that a golf cart can barely navigate. You cannot tow it. You have to fix it." Greg swallowed hard. "If you could just try the ignition sequence one more time, ma'am." Natalia sighed, the sound sharp and exhausted. She opened the feather-light carbon door, slid into the contoured leather bucket seat, and pressed the glass ignition button on the center console. The dashboard lit up like a fighter jet. A digital screen flashed the Mantova logo. But when she pushed the engine start button, there was no roar. There was only a hollow mechanical clack. Then a faint, high-pitched whine. Then silence. "See?" Natalia said, stepping back out. "Dead." "The computer says there's no fault," one of the junior technicians muttered, staring at his screen as if it had betrayed him. "Then the computer is lying," a gruff voice echoed from the elevator bay. Natalia turned. Frank, the building's head of maintenance, was walking toward them, jangling a heavy ring of keys. He was a man who had survived 30 years in commercial real estate by knowing exactly when to stay out of the way, so his presence here meant he had a solution. "I heard the commotion on the radio," Frank said, nodding respectfully to Natalia. "They can't get it going?" "They are currently trying to wish it into starting, Frank," Natalia replied. "It's not working." Frank looked at the sweating technicians and their laptops. He shook his head. "Ms. Hayes, these boys are software guys. They're looking at code. But that thing," he pointed a thick, calloused finger at the hypercar, "is still a machine. It's metal, gas, and spark. If the computer says it's fine and it ain't, you don't need a programmer. You need a mechanic." Natalia checked her watch. 42 minutes. "And do you have a mechanic in your pocket, Frank?" "I got a guy," Frank said. "Runs an independent shop out in the East Ward. Kept my old truck running past 400,000 miles. He doesn't plug things into screens. He just knows how engines breathe." Greg scoffed. his face flushing red. With all due respect, this is a naturally aspirated, electronically governed V12 with a proprietary management system. A corner garage grease monkey is not touching a $7 million vehicle. He'll void the warranty just by looking at it. Natalia looked at Greg. Then she looked at the silent, useless car. The warranty meant absolutely nothing if she missed her meeting, lost the room's momentum, and watched a multi-billion-dollar deal evaporate because she couldn't get out of her own building. She turned back to Frank. Call him. Tell him I'll pay him $2,000 if he gets here in 15 minutes, and $5,000 if he starts the car. 6 miles away, in a kitchen that smelled faintly of burnt toast and heavily of financial desperation, David was scraping the blackened edges off a piece of bread. He dumped the scraped crumbs into the sink, rinsed the knife, and set the toast on a paper plate next to a small pile of scrambled eggs. "Eat up, bug," David said, sliding the plate across the chipped linoleum table. 7-year-old Chloe looked at the food with tired, skeptical eyes. She had his messy brown hair and her mother's sharp, observant gaze. "It's still black on the bottom, Dad." "It's rustic," David said, forcing a smile. "Builds character." Chloe picked up a fork and started pushing the eggs around. "Are you going to be home for dinner tonight?" David felt a familiar, heavy tightness in his chest. It was the same tightness he felt every time he looked at the stack of envelopes on the counter. The red ink, final notice. The medical bills from Sarah's final months in the ICU hadn't vanished when she did. They had simply mutated, growing late fees and interest, a relentless parasite feeding on his grief. He had sold the house. They had moved to this cramped apartment. He had taken on every side job he could find. It was never enough. "I'll try, sweetie," he said softly, leaning down to tie her left sneaker. The sole was starting to separate from the fabric. He needed to buy her new shoes. That was another $40 he didn't have. "Mrs. Gable is going to pick you up from school, okay? You'll do your homework at her place." Chloe nodded, resigned. She was too young to be this understanding, and that broke his heart more than a tantrum would have. His phone buzzed on the counter. It vibrated against the unpaid electric bill. David picked it up, wiping grease off his thumb onto his jeans before swiping the screen. "Yeah, Frank, what's up?" "Davy, where are you?" Frank's voice was loud, echoing against concrete. "Getting Chloe ready for school. Why?" "I need you downtown, right now, beneath the Apex Tower, sub-basement 4. David sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Frank, I have 3 cars at the shop waiting for transmission drops, and I'm already behind. I can't do a commercial call right now." "It's not a pipe, Davy. It's a car." Frank lowered his voice. The building owner, her fancy Italian rocket ship died in the garage. Dealership guys are here with iPads, crying because the car won't talk to them. She's offering $2,000 just to show up in 15 minutes. 5 if you fix it. David froze. The tightness in his chest hitched. $2,000. That was the rent. That was the shoes. That was breathing room for a month. 15 minutes? David asked, looking at the wall clock. Traffic heading downtown this time of morning was a nightmare. "You better fly, kid," Frank said, and hung up. David looked at Chloe. She had finished her eggs and was swinging her legs under the chair. "Change of plans, Bug," David said, grabbing his keys and a heavy canvas tool bag from by the door. "I'm dropping you off early. Breakfast club." He didn't wait for her to complain. He ushered her out the door, locked it, and hurried down the apartment stairs. His 2004 Ford Ranger started on the first crank. It was ugly, the paint peeling on the hood like a bad sunburn, and the shocks squeaked over every speed bump. But the engine was immaculate. David had rebuilt it himself, balancing the crankshaft and replacing every seal. It sounded rough to a layman, but to David, it hummed with perfect mechanical honesty. He dropped Chloe at the elementary school's early care entrance, gave her a quick kiss on the forehead, and merged onto the interstate. He drove with aggressive precision, threading the bulky truck through the morning gridlock. He didn't think about the $5,000. If you thought about the money, you got nervous. If you got nervous, you made mistakes. He just thought about the metal. Engines were simple, no matter how much carbon fiber and Italian leather they wrapped them in. They needed three things: air, fuel, and spark. If you had all three at the right time, combustion happened. It was the only law that mattered. Computers could fail, sensors could lie, but physics was absolute. 14 minutes later, David's battered truck rattled down the descending concrete ramp of the Apex Tower's underground garage. He passed rows of Mercedes, Audis, and Range Rovers, finally reaching the lowest level. The lighting down here was stark and white, illuminating a scene that looked like a pit stop gone horribly wrong. David parked his truck a polite distance away. He killed the engine, grabbed his canvas bag, and stepped out. The sound of his heavy, steel-toed boots hitting the floor echoed loudly in the cavernous space. He wore faded denim jeans, a gray t-shirt stretched over broad, tired shoulders, and a flannel jacket that had seen better decades. His hands were permanently stained with a shadow of grease that soap could no longer reach. He walked toward the group. He saw Frank, who gave him a brief nod. He saw the three dealership mechanics, looking at him with undisguised contempt. And then he saw her. She was standing near the front of the low, wide, impossibly aggressive-looking car. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than his truck. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, perfect knot. But it was her eyes that caught him. They were sharp, intelligent, and utterly devoid of patience. "You're late," Natalia said, looking at the Rolex on her wrist. 16 minutes. David didn't apologize. He didn't flinch. He just looked at the car. "Traffic," he said simply. He dropped his canvas bag on the concrete with a heavy thud. The dealership guys winced. "Are you the mechanic?" Natalia asked, her tone dripping with doubt. She took in his worn clothes, the tired lines around his eyes, the absolute lack of any digital equipment. "I'm David," he said, stepping closer to the Mantova. "What's it doing?" Greg, the lead technician, stepped in front of the car, blocking David's path. "It's doing nothing that you can fix, pal. The ECU is completely locked. We're running a full system diagnostic." David looked at Greg. Then he looked down at the ruggedized laptop resting on a microfiber towel on the car's roof. "What does the computer say?" David asked. "It says everything is optimal," Greg snapped. "There are no fault codes." David nodded slowly. He stepped around Greg, ignoring the man's indignant huff, and walked to the rear of the car where the massive V12 engine sat under a vented glass cover. "If the computer says it's fine, and it won't start," David said, his voice calm, rumbling in the quiet garage, "then the computer is blind." He looked at Natalia. "Who's got the keys?" Natalia held out the heavy, fobless key. David didn't take it. "You do it," he said. "Get in, I want to hear it." Natalia hesitated. She was used to giving orders, to having experts defer to her, to men in expensive suits nodding vigorously at her every word. This guy, smelling faintly of stale coffee and engine oil, was just looking at her, waiting. "Ms. Hayes, I really advise against letting an unauthorized person dictate our diagnostic process," Greg protested, stepping forward. Natalia held up a single manicured hand. Greg stopped talking instantly. She looked at David. His face was entirely unreadable. He wasn't intimidated by her wealth, and he wasn't trying to impress her. He just wanted to do the job. She respected that. She opened the door and slid back into the driver's seat. "Don't turn it over yet," David called out. He walked around to the rear passenger side, pressing his ear close to the carbon fiber flank, right above the rear wheel well. He closed his eyes. "Okay," David said. "Turn the battery on. Just the ignition, not the engine." Natalia pressed the glass button once. The car hummed. The dashboard lit up. "Did you hear that?" Greg sneered. "The fuel pump's primed. The system is pressurized." David kept his eyes closed. "I heard a pump. I didn't hear pressure." He stood up and looked through the glass engine cover. "Try to start it." Natalia pressed the brake and pushed the starter button. The starter motor engaged. A harsh, metallic clack, 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 spinning the massive engine over, but there was no ignition. No fire. Just a high-pitched, desperate whine from the rear of the car that faded as Natalia took her finger off the button. "Dead," she said, looking out the window at him. Same as before. David didn't answer. He was staring at the engine bay. The internal architecture of a bespoke V12 was complex, a labyrinth of braided hoses, carbon intakes, and heat shielding. But physics was physics. "Do it again," David said. "Hold it for 5 seconds." "You're going to flood the cylinders," Greg barked, stepping toward David. "If it's not firing, you're just dumping raw fuel into the exhaust. You'll ruin the catalytic converters." David turned his head and locked eyes with the dealership tech. "You just told me the computer says everything is fine. You told me the pump's primed. But when she cranks it, the engine isn't fighting. There's no compression resistance from combustion. It's starving." David looked back at Natalia. "Crank it." Natalia held the button. Clack, 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 clack. The high whine returned, vibrating slightly through the floorboards. "Stop," David said. He walked over to his canvas bag, knelt down, and unzipped it. The tools inside weren't shiny. They were worn, scarred from years of brutal work. He bypassed the ratchets and the wrenches, reaching past a multimeter, and pulled out a long, heavy, solid steel pry bar with a thick rubber handle. Greg's eyes widened in horror. "What are you doing? Step away from the vehicle." David ignored him. He walked back to the car. "Pop the engine glass," he told Natalia. She hit the release switch on the door panel. The hydraulic struts hissed as the glass canopy rose, exposing the beautiful, intimidating metal beast beneath. David leaned over the fender, being careful not to let his belt buckle touch the paint. He peered into the tight gap between the right side intake manifold and the firewall. "These high-end Italian rigs," David said, his voice muffled as he looked deep into the engine bay. "They overcomplicate the plumbing to meet emissions. You've got a primary fuel pump in the tank, right? But you've also got a mechanical check valve on the high-pressure rail to prevent backflow when the engine shuts off." He slid the long steel pry bar down into the dark recess of the engine bay, carefully threading it past a bundle of delicate wiring harnesses. "The computer monitors the electronic solenoid that tells the valve to open," David continued, shifting his weight. "Your iPad says the solenoid is getting voltage. The computer thinks the gate is open. But the valve itself? The physical piece of brass and spring inside the housing? It's jammed closed. Probably a bad batch of fuel, or just sat too long. The pump is screaming, trying to push gas against a closed door." "You can't know that without running a pressure delta test!" Greg shouted, stepping forward to physically grab David's shoulder. David didn't even look up. He just shifted his stance, and his shoulder bumped Greg's hand away with a solid, immovable force. "Don't touch me." David positioned the flat end of the heavy pry bar directly against the housing of the mechanical check valve, buried deep out of sight. "Hey!" Greg yelled. "Ms. Hayes, he's going to damage a $10,000 component." "Quiet," Natalia said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the garage like a razor. She was watching David's hands. They were steady. David gripped the rubber handle of the pry bar. He didn't hit it hard. He didn't swing. He just used the heel of his palm to deliver one sharp, perfectly angled, concussive smack to the top of the handle. A dull thunk echoed from deep within the engine block. David carefully withdrew the pry bar. He looked at Natalia. "Try it now." Natalia took a breath. She pushed the brake pedal. She pressed the glass button. The starter motor clicked once. And then, with a concussive roar that shook the dust from the concrete ceiling, the V12 detonated into life. The sound was apocalyptic. A furious, roaring idol that bounced off the underground walls, a deep, resonant symphony of 12 cylinders firing in perfect, violent harmony. The smell of rich, combusted, high-octane fuel instantly filled the air. Natalia gasped, her hands gripping the suede steering wheel. She felt the vibration through her chest. The car was alive. Greg staggered backward, his mouth open, staring at the roaring engine as if it were a ghost. His two junior techs looked down at their laptops, which had suddenly lit up with a flurry of real-time data, completely oblivious to the physical world a moment before. David stepped back from the exhaust wash. He wiped a smudge of grease off his thumb, walked over to his canvas bag, and dropped the pry bar back inside. He zipped it shut. The engine settled into a low, menacing growl. Natalia let it idle, unbuckled her seatbelt, and stepped out. The adrenaline was making her hands shake slightly, but she hid it well. She looked at the dealership technicians. "Pack up your toys," she said to Greg over the noise of the engine, "and send the bill to my assistant. We will be discussing your contract next week." Greg looked like he wanted to argue, but the sheer volume of the running engine and the terrifying calm in Natalia's eyes silenced him. He snapped his laptop shut and hurried toward the elevator, his crew trailing behind him. Natalia turned to David. He was already slinging the heavy bag over his shoulder. "You hit it," she said, raising an eyebrow. "You fixed a $7 million car by hitting it." "I didn't just hit it," David said, his voice loud enough to carry over the exhaust note. "I hit the exact part that was stuck, with exactly enough force to dislodge the spring without cracking the housing. The computer can tell you what it thinks is happening, but metal talks. You just have to know how to listen." Natalia stared at him. For the first time all morning, the crushing weight of her day seemed to lift. She pulled a slim leather checkbook from her jacket pocket, grabbed a pen, and rested it on the roof of the car. She wrote quickly, tore the check free, and held it out. David reached out and took it. He glanced at the numbers. It was made out for $10,000. He looked back at her. "The deal was 5. Consider it a retainer," Natalia said, opening the door of the Mantova. "I have a fleet of transport trucks that seem to break down every time it rains, and I clearly need someone who knows how to listen." She didn't wait for an answer. She pulled the door shut, shifted the hypercar into gear, and drove up the ramp, the V12 echoing like a thunderstorm fading into the distance. David stood alone in the quiet garage, holding the check. He thought about Chloe. He thought about the shoes. He folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket, and walked back to his rusty truck. It was going to be a good day. $10,000 is a lot of money until you actually need it. Then, it evaporates like water on a hot exhaust manifold. David sat at his chipped kitchen table under the harsh glare of a single, bare 60-watt bulb. It was 11:30 p.m. The apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the ancient refrigerator and the soft, rhythmic breathing of Chloe from the bedroom down the short hall. Spread out before him was the anatomy of his ruin. White envelopes with red borders. Statements from the hospital network that had spent 8 months failing to keep his wife, Sarah, alive. Notices from a collection agency in Ohio. Past due electricity bills. The cashier's check for Natalia Hayes' $10,000 lay in the center of the mess. He had taken it to her corporate bank that afternoon. The teller, a young guy in a sharp vest, had looked at David's grease-stained hands, then at the signature on the check, and finally back at David with a raised eyebrow. But the ink was wet. The account was ironclad, and the bank handed over a stack of $100 bills bound in a paper strap. Now, David opened his laptop. He started logging into portals. He didn't feel rich. He felt like a man bailing out a sinking rowboat with a slightly larger bucket. $3,000 went instantly to the hospital's aggressive billing department to stop them from garnishing his meager garage wages. $1,400 went to the landlord to clear the back rent and prepay the next month. $800 cleared the credit card he used strictly for groceries. $600 to the utility companies. By 12:15 a.m., the $10,000 was gone. He had exactly $940 left in his checking account. David rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, feeling the grit of the day scratching against his eyelids. He looked at the empty paper strap that had held the cash. It was just paper. All of it. The bills, the checks, the debt. It was all a giant, invisible architecture designed to crush you. But for the first time in 3 years, the crushing had paused. The red letters were gone. Tomorrow's mail wouldn't bring a threat. He pushed back from the table and walked into Chloe's room. A plastic nightlight cast a blue glow over her face. Her breathing was steady. Next to her bed, sitting perfectly parallel on the faded rug, was a brand new pair of sneakers. They were bright purple with thick, aggressive treads. They had cost $65. When she had put them on in the store, she hadn't just walked. She had bounced, testing the springs. Her face lit up with a small, rare, unburdened smile. David sat on the edge of her mattress. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of brown hair from her forehead. "We bought some time, Bug," he whispered into the dark room. He didn't know who Natalia Hayes really was. He didn't care about her billion-dollar deals or her carbon fiber toys. But he silently thanked the chaotic universe that her overpriced Italian machine had refused to spark on this specific Tuesday. He stood up, his knees popping in the quiet room, and went to set his alarm for 5 a.m. The transmissions at the shop weren't going to drop themselves. 72 hours later, Natalia stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the port of Newark. The rain was lashing against the reinforced glass in violent, horizontal sheets. The acquisition had closed. She was now the undisputed sovereign of a logistics network that stretched from Maine to Florida. The business press was calling her a visionary. Her board was thrilled. Her stock options had vested beautifully. She had a migraine that felt like an ice pick behind her left eye. "Read the numbers again, Arthur," she said, not turning away from the window. Below, the massive container yard was a blur of yellow sodium lights, wet asphalt, and idling diesel engines. Arthur, her vice president of fleet operations, shifted uncomfortably in a leather chair at the massive conference table. He was a man who lived and died by spreadsheets. "Current downtime for the northeast sector is at 18%, Natalia," Arthur said, his voice tight. "Specifically, the heavy haul routes. We have 42 rigs currently stranded on shoulders or sitting in maintenance bays between here and Boston." Natalia finally turned. She walked over to the table and picked up a tablet. It showed a map of the eastern seaboard covered in red dots. Every dot was a broken truck. Every broken truck was a late delivery. Every late delivery was a breach of contract with companies that did not tolerate failure. 18% of my fleet is dead in the water, Arthur." "Why?" "It's cascading," Arthur explained, tapping his own screen. "The diagnostic logs are pulling up a dozen different fault codes. Injector timing errors, DPF filter clogs, loss of rail pressure. The manufacturer is sending a team of software engineers down on Monday to flash the ECUs. They think it's a firmware bug in the new emission control modules." Natalia felt a cold spike of familiar irritation. Software engineers, diagnostic logs, firmware. "Monday is unacceptable," she said, her voice dropping to that flat, dangerous register that made executives sweat. "We are moving perishable freight. We are moving medical supplies. If those trucks sit until Monday, The penalties will wipe out our Q3 margins. I want mechanics on those trucks, not programmers." The dealership mechanics are baffled, Natalia. They swap an injector, clear the code, send the truck out, and it dies 50 miles down the turnpike. The computer is telling them one thing, but the engines are doing another. Natalia froze. The computer is telling them one thing, but the engines are doing another. The memory of the sub-basement garage flared in her mind. The smell of rich exhaust. The sound of a heavy steel pry bar hitting metal. A man with tired eyes who didn't look at screens. She looked at her assistant, a hyper-efficient young woman named Sarah who was standing by the door. "Sarah, the mechanic who fixed my car on Tuesday. Did we get his contact information?" Sarah nodded instantly. "Frank, in maintenance, forwarded his business card. David Miller. Runs a small commercial and independent shop in the East Ward." "Call him," Natalia ordered. Arthur looked genuinely appalled. "Natalia, you cannot bring a local grease monkey into a unionized corporate freight depot to look at $500,000 commercial rigs. There are protocols, liability, insurance." Natalia leaned over the table, planting her hands flat on the polished mahogany. "Arthur, my trucks are bleeding out on the highway. Your protocols are currently costing me $600,000 an hour. I don't need a presentation on liability. I need someone who knows how to listen to a broken machine." She looked back at Sarah. "Offer him double his standard hourly rate. Tell him to meet me at the Newark Depot in 40 minutes. The Newark Depot was a concrete wasteland of roaring engines, hissing air brakes, and the sharp, choking smell of atomized diesel. David pulled his Ford Ranger up to the security gate. The rain was relentless, drumming a chaotic rhythm on the truck's thin roof. He rolled down the window, letting the cold spray hit his face. The security guard checked a clipboard, looked surprised, and waved him through toward Bay 4. He parked next to a line of slick, black corporate SUVs. It was like parking a dinghy next to a fleet of destroyers. He grabbed his canvas bag, pulled up the collar of his faded canvas jacket, and stepped out into the deluge. Inside Bay 4, the noise was deafening. It was an echoing cavern of corrugated steel. 3 massive Freightliner Cascadia trucks sat in the bays, their hoods tilted forward like gaping jaws. Natalia was standing near the front of the center truck. She was wearing a trench coat over her tailored suit, looking entirely out of place in the grease and grime, yet completely commanding the space. She was surrounded by 3 men in high-vis vests and hard hats who looked deeply unhappy. David walked up, his heavy boots squelching on the wet concrete. Natalia saw him. The tension in her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "Mr. Miller," she said, loud enough to be heard over the background roar of the depot. "Ms. Hayes?" David nodded. He didn't look at the corporate guys. He looked at the trucks. "You're a long way from the executive garage." "My fleet is dying," Natalia said, stepping closer to him. 18% failure rate over the last 4 days. Same symptoms across the board. Loss of power under load. Stalling out on grades. The diagnostic computers are throwing dozens of different codes. My people say it's software. The dealership says it's software." "And you don't buy it," David said. "I buy results," she replied. "And right now, I have 0. One of the men in the high-vis vests stepped forward. It was Arthur. "This is highly irregular, Natalia. This equipment requires certified factory diagnostic tools." David finally looked at Arthur. He took in the clean hands, the perfectly crisp safety vest, the clipboard. "Diagnostic tools read the sensors," David said, his voice calm, cutting through the depot's noise with a heavy, grounded gravity. "If the sensors are getting bad information, they feed bad data to the computer. The computer panics and shuts the engine down to protect itself. Throwing parts at a code is how you waste money. What did you change this week?" Arthur bristled. "Excuse me? You're a fleet manager," David said, dropping his heavy canvas bag onto a metal workbench. "Trucks are machines of habit. They break down in predictable patterns based on mileage and wear. An 18% failure rate in 4 days isn't wear and tear. It's an infection. Something was introduced to the system. Did you change your maintenance schedule? Did you switch oil viscosity? Did you change fuel suppliers? Arthur crossed his arms. We optimize our supply chain constantly. We transitioned to a new bulk supplier for our terminal diesel on Monday, a bioblend, completely within federal specifications. It saves the company 4 cents a gallon. David stopped moving. He stared at Arthur for a long, silent moment. Then he looked at Natalia. 4 cents a gallon, David muttered. He shook his head. He turned and walked toward the massive front right tire of the center truck. "Pop the hood," he yelled to a depot mechanic standing nearby. The mechanic looked at Arthur, who gave a stiff nod. The hood was already open. David climbed onto the wet tire, leaning deep into the massive engine bay. Rain blew in through the open bay doors, soaking his back, but he didn't seem to notice. He reached past the blazing hot exhaust manifold, his hands finding the primary fuel filter housing, a cylindrical canister the size of a coffee can. "Bring me a strap wrench and an empty drain pan," David barked. A depot mechanic scurried over with the tools. David didn't wait. He snapped the strap wrench around the housing. It was tight. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his forearms bunching under the grease and rain, and hauled on the handle. The seal broke with a sharp crack. He unscrewed the housing the rest of the way by hand, quickly dropping the heavy, fuel-filled canister into the plastic drain pan before it could spill all over the engine. He climbed down from the tire and carried the pan over to the workbench. Natalia walked over, ignoring the grime that brushed against her expensive coat. Arthur and the others followed. David reached into the dark, foul-smelling diesel fuel in the pan and pulled out the paper filter element. It was supposed to be a firm, corrugated cylinder. Instead, it was a swollen, gelatinous mass of black sludge. It looked like crushed velvet soaked in tar. David threw the ruined filter onto the metal bench with a wet slap. "There's your software bug," David said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Arthur stared at the sludge, blinking. "What is that?" "The fuel is certified." "The fuel might be certified in a lab," David said, his tone devoid of any respect for Arthur's title. "But biodiesel acts as a solvent. It scours the inside of your bulk storage tanks. If your new, cheaper supplier didn't treat their fuel for microbial growth, algae, or if they pumped it into old tanks that had water condensation, the bioblend strips all that gunk off the walls and suspends it in the fuel." David pointed a stained finger at the ruined filter. "Your trucks suck up that sludge. It hits the primary filter. The filter does its job and catches it. But because there's so much of it, the filter clogs in 50 miles. The high-pressure fuel pump starves. It tries to pull fuel that isn't there, which creates cavitation, air bubbles. The sensors read low rail pressure, bad injector timing, and excessive exhaust heat all at once. The computer panics and throws 10 different codes. David looked directly at Natalia. "Your dealership mechanics are reading the panic. They aren't looking at the cause. They change an injector, clear the computer, send it out, and 50 miles later the new filter clogs with the same bad fuel. You're poisoning your own fleet to save 4 cents a gallon." The silence in the bay was profound, broken only by the sound of the rain and a distant air horn. Arthur opened his mouth, closed it, and looked down at his clipboard as if it could save him. It couldn't. Natalia stared at the black sludge on the table. She didn't look angry. She looked incredibly, ruthlessly awake. She turned to Arthur. "Isolate the bulk tanks. Pump them out. Call the old supplier, I don't care what the premium is. Get clean diesel in here by midnight. Have the night shift drop the tanks on every stalled truck, flush the lines, and change the filters." "Natalia, the cost of pumping those bulk tanks—" "Arthur," Natalia interrupted, her voice soft and deadly. "If you mention a spreadsheet right now, you will be looking for a job in the morning. Go." Arthur swallowed hard, turned on his heel, and fast-walked toward the depot office, yelling for his foreman. Natalia stood alone with David by the workbench. The chaos of the depot swirled around them, but in that small radius, it was oddly quiet. She looked at him. He was soaked. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his hands were coated in black diesel slime. He wasn't looking at her for validation. He was looking at the engine block of the truck, his mind already moving on to the next mechanical problem. "You don't care about the money, do you?" Natalia asked suddenly. David stopped wiping his hands. He looked at her. He thought about the stack of bills, the red letters, Chloe's $65 shoes. "I care about the money, Miss Hayes. Very much," David said quietly. "It keeps the lights on. It keeps my kid fed." He tossed the dirty shop rag onto the bench. "But money doesn't fix a machine. Logic does. Physics does. You people live up in these towers, moving numbers around on screens, and you think that's reality. But when the engine stops, the numbers don't matter. The metal matters." Natalia held his gaze. She had spent 20 years in boardrooms, surrounded by men who lied to her, managed her, or feared her. This man simply diagnosed the truth, however ugly it was, and laid it on the table. "You're right," she said. It was the first time she had admitted that to anyone in a decade. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and tapped a few buttons. "I'm keeping you on retainer, David. A real one this time. Not just for my car, for my reality checks." David shook his head. "I run a shop, Ms. Hayes. I have customers. I can't be at your beck and call every time one of your suits buys cheap gas." "Natalia," she said. David paused. "What?" "My name is Natalia. If you're going to tell me when my people are being idiots, you should use my name." She looked out at the rain. "I'll double your shop's hourly rate for any consulting. You set the hours. You don't answer to Arthur, you answer to me." David looked at the billionaire CEO standing in the freezing rain, breathing in diesel fumes as if it were mountain air. She was fierce, unyielding, and utterly practical. "All right, Natalia," David said, zipping up his canvas bag. "But the next time I have to come out in the rain, I'm charging you for a new jacket." A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of Natalia's mouth. Deal. 3 weeks later, the air in David's East Ward garage tasted of atomized brake cleaner and old coffee. It was a cinder block box with 3 bays, a sagging roof, and a waiting room that consisted of a torn vinyl couch and a stack of car magazines from 2018. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest. David was under a rusted 2011 Chevy Silverado, fighting a seized sway bar link with an acetylene torch. The blue flame hissed, heating the stubborn bolt cherry red. Sweat stung his eyes. He killed the torch, grabbed a breaker bar, and threw his weight against the handle. With a sharp, violent crack, the rust surrendered. The bolt turned. "Dad!" David dropped the breaker bar. He rolled out from under the truck on his creeper, wiping soot from his forehead. Chloe was sitting on a stack of winter tires near the office door, her legs kicking rhythmically. She was holding a tablet, her face illuminated by the harsh white light of a math game. The purple sneakers were scuffed now, broken in, looking like they belonged to a kid who actually played at recess. "What's up, Bug?" David asked, standing up and grabbing a red shop rag from his back pocket. "There's a spaceship in the parking lot," she said, pointing a tiny finger toward the open bay doors. David turned. It wasn't a spaceship, but in this neighborhood it might as well have been. Natalia's matte obsidian Mantova V12 was idling on the cracked asphalt, looking entirely out of place next to the faded sedans and battered pickup trucks, waiting for service. The low, menacing burble of the exhaust vibrated against the cinder block walls. The engine cut off. The driver's door swung up on its dihedral hinges. Natalia stepped out. Today she wasn't wearing a corporate suit. She wore dark denim, a plain black cashmere sweater, and leather boots. She looked less like a CEO and more like a mercenary on a day off. She carried a sleek silver briefcase and 2 large cardboard cups from an artisan coffee shop that David knew charged $8 a latte. She walked into the bay, her boots crunching over stray ball bearings and dried oil sweep. David didn't move to greet her. He just watched her navigate the organized chaos of his life. She stopped in front of Chloe. She looked at the little girl on the tires. Chloe looked back, entirely unfazed. "You must be Chloe," Natalia said. Her voice lacked the sharp, demanding edge she used in boardrooms. It was just quiet. Chloe nodded. "You have a very loud car. It has a lot to say," Natalia replied. She held out one of the cardboard cups. "I brought your dad coffee. But I was told by a very reliable source in my office that 7-year-olds prefer hot chocolate, with extra whipped cream." Chloe's eyes widened. She looked at David for permission. David gave a single, slow nod. Chloe reached out and took the cup, clutching it with both hands. "Thank you, spaceship lady." A brief, genuine smile touched Natalia's lips. She walked over to David, holding out the second cup. "I'm off the clock, Natalia," David said, taking the coffee. It was searing hot and smelled like roasted heaven. "And none of your trucks can fit in my lot." I checked. "It's not the trucks," Natalia said. She looked around the garage. She took in the pegboards meticulously organized with tools, the heavy steel workbenches scarred from heavy impacts, the smell of grease and hard labor. It was a place where things made sense, where action equaled reaction. "I needed to be somewhere that wasn't glass and steel," she said softly. David took a sip of the coffee. He looked at her closely. The sharp, unyielding armor she wore was still there, but there were micro-fractures in it today. The skin under her eyes was bruised with exhaustion. Her shoulders carried a tension that had nothing to do with broken machinery. "My office couch is torn," David said, gesturing to the small glass-enclosed room in the corner. "But the door locks, if you need to hide." "I don't hide, David." "Everyone hides," he corrected. "Some people just buy more expensive bunkers." Natalia looked at him. She let out a long, slow breath. "My board is initiating a vote of no confidence tomorrow morning. They are trying to remove me as CEO." David didn't gasp. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He walked over to a heavy red snap-on tool chest, leaned against it, and took another sip of coffee. "Because of the trucks?" he asked. "Because of the money," Natalia said, walking toward him. "The heavy haul delays cost us $3 million in penalties before we flushed the bad fuel out of the system. I authorized a unilateral purge of the supplier contract and paid a massive premium to get clean diesel immediately. It saved the fleet, but it destroyed our quarterly earnings report." "You fixed the problem," David said. "The engine was choking. You gave it air." In corporate logistics, David, they don't care if the engine is choking, as long as the spreadsheet says it's running efficiently on paper. A faction of the board, led by a man named Richard, is using the Q3 losses as leverage. They want to sell off the Eastern Division to a private equity firm, strip it down, sell the parts. David understood that. It happened to old cars all the time. A beautiful, complex machine deemed too expensive to run, so it was chopped up and sold as scrap to the highest bidder. It was a failure of imagination, a failure of respect. "So what are you going to do?" David asked. "I am going to fight them," Natalia said, her voice turning cold and hard. "But Richard has the votes. He spent the last 3 weeks whispering in the ears of the shareholders, blaming me for the hasty and expensive maintenance overhaul. He is isolating me." David set his coffee down on the steel bench. He looked over at Chloe, who was happily buried in her hot chocolate, completely oblivious to the billion-dollar war being waged in the dirty garage. You're a mechanic, David, Natalia said, looking at him with an intensity that practically burned. When a system is completely locked up, when the sensors are lying, the computer is panicking, and the machine is eating itself from the inside out. What do you do? David picked up a heavy, grease-stained rag. He wiped his hands, though they were already clean. He thought about the Mantova in the basement. He thought about the rusted sway bar bolt he had just torched. You stop asking the system for permission, David said. Natalia went still. Explain. When a computer thinks the car is fine, but the car is dead, you bypass the computer. You go to the metal. You force a physical reset. David threw the rag onto the bench. Your board members are just broken sensors, Natalia. They're feeding bad data to the shareholders. If you try to argue with them on their terms, in boardrooms, with pie charts, you lose. They control that interface. He stepped closer to her, his height and broad shoulders casting a shadow over the silver briefcase. You need to cut the power, David said, his voice a low rumble. You strip the threads. You bypass the board and go directly to the people pulling the levers. Natalia stared at the cinder block wall behind David. Her mind, usually a high-speed processor of risk and reward, was suddenly quiet. Bypass the computer. Go to the metal. Richard is holding a proxy block from our 3 largest institutional investors, Natalia said, speaking more to herself than to David. He's speaking for them, but he isn't them. If a middleman is giving you a bad part, David said, you don't ask the middleman to fix it. You call the factory. Natalia looked at David. The exhaustion in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, terrifying clarity. It was the look of a predator that had just realized the cage door was unlatched. The institutional investors, Natalia muttered. They aren't attending the board meeting tomorrow. They just sent Richard their proxies based on his summary of the Q3 losses. She grabbed her phone from her pocket. She looked at the time. 4:15 p.m. Where are they? David asked. Chicago? Boston? New York? Natalia said, her thumbs flying across the screen as she drafted a message to her assistant, Sarah. They rely on stability. Richard sold them a story that I am chaotic, unstable, costing them dividends. Then show them the real math, David said, not the paper math. Natalia put her phone down. She looked at the rusted Chevy on the lift, then at David. Why do you do this? She asked. The question was sudden, shifting the gravity in the room. Do what? This. She gestured to the grimy shop, the heavy tools, the endless line of broken machines. You're brilliant. Your diagnostic logic is flawless. You could be running the engineering floor of any manufacturer in Detroit or Stuttgart. Instead, you're fighting rusted bolts in a failing neighborhood. David looked away. He looked at Chloe, who was now drawing on a piece of scrap cardboard with a blue marker. He walked over to a small mini fridge tucked beneath a workbench, pulled out 2 bottles of cheap domestic beer, popped the caps on the edge of the metal bench, and handed one to Natalia. She took it without hesitation. David took a long drink. The beer was cold, sharp, and bitter. 3 years ago, David said, his voice quiet, devoid of any self-pity. My wife, Sarah, she got a cough that wouldn't go away. Went to the clinic. They gave her antibiotics. The cough stayed. 6 months later, she collapsed in the kitchen. Stage 4. Natalia held her beer, perfectly still. She didn't offer a hollow, I'm sorry. She knew David wouldn't want it. We spent 8 months in hospitals, David continued, staring at the label on his bottle. The best doctors, the most expensive machines, monitors, IVs, chemo drips. I watched them plug her into a wall of computers. They had 1 million data points. Blood oxygen, heart rate, white cell counts. He gripped the bottle tighter, the knuckles on his scarred hands turning white. And none of it mattered. The doctors were looking at the screens, telling me what the numbers meant, but they couldn't stop it. The machine was breaking down, and there was no wrench, no pry bar, no reset switch that could fix it. The human body doesn't have a check valve you can hit with a hammer. He looked up, meeting Natalia's eyes. When she died, the medical bills buried me. I lost the house. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner. I started taking every side job I could. David gestured to the shop. I don't do this because I love fighting's rust. I do it because metal has rules. If it breaks, there is a physical reason. If you find the reason, you can fix the machine. It makes sense. It's the only thing in my life that makes sense, besides her. He nodded toward Chloe. Natalia looked at the little girl, then back at David. She had spent her life acquiring power to ensure she would never be vulnerable. She built a fortress of money and authority. But looking at David, she realized that true strength wasn't about building a fortress. It was about knowing how to rebuild after the fortress burned down. She set her half-empty beer on the workbench. She picked up her silver briefcase. "You're wrong about one thing, David," Natalia said. David raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? I'm not going to cut the power to the board," she said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I'm going to rip the engine out and drop a new one in." She turned and walked toward her car. She paused at the door, looking back at the mechanic who had just handed her the blueprint for a corporate slaughter. "Keep your phone on tomorrow," Natalia said. "I might need a reality check." She got into the Mantova. The V12 roared to life, shaking the dust from the rafters, and she tore out of the parking lot, merging into the evening traffic like a dark missile. David watched her go. He finished his beer, tossed the bottle into a recycling bin, and walked over to Chloe. "Time to pack up, Bug," he said, picking up her backpack. "Let's go home." Friday morning, 9 a.m., the boardroom of Apex Logistics was perched on the 42nd floor, a sweeping expanse of glass overlooking the city skyline. 12 men and women in bespoke suits sat around a massive oval table of polished walnut. Richard, a man with perfectly styled silver hair and a smile that never reached his eyes, stood at the head of the table. Given the disastrous handling of the Q3 maintenance crisis and the resulting financial hemorrhage, Richard said, his voice dripping with faux regret, "It is my motion that we hold an immediate vote to relieve Natalia Hayes of her duties as Chief Executive Officer, pending a full restructure." Several board members nodded solemnly. Natalia sat at the opposite end of the table. She didn't look angry. She looked incredibly, dangerously bored. She checked her watch. 9:02 a.m. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. 3 people walked in. They were not board members. They were the managing directors of the 3 largest institutional investment firms on the East Coast. The people who owned the money that owned the board. Richard's face drained of color. "Gentlemen, what is this? This is a closed session." The lead investor, a stern man named Thomas, dropped a thick, leather-bound folder onto the table. "Ms. Hayes sent an aircraft for us last night," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "She also sent us the unedited telemetry data from the fleet, the fuel invoices, and the independent diagnostic reports regarding the contaminated biodiesel." Thomas looked at Richard with absolute disgust. "You told us she panicked and spent millions on unnecessary maintenance, costing us our dividend. The data proves that your cost-cutting measure on cheap fuel nearly destroyed half the fleet's high-pressure injection systems. Ms. Hayes didn't cost us money, Richard. She saved us from a total operational collapse." Natalia stood up. She smoothed the front of her jacket. "The motion on the table is invalid, Richard," Natalia said, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "Because as of 5 minutes ago, the primary shareholders have withdrawn their proxies from you. You no longer have a vote." She looked around the table at the terrified board members. "In fact," Natalia continued, "a new motion is being filed. A complete restructuring of the Oversight Committee. Richard, you will resign by noon, or we will pursue civil litigation for fiduciary negligence regarding the fuel contracts." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The computer had panicked. The system was resetting. Natalia walked toward the door. "Thomas will handle the transition details. I have a meeting." She didn't look back as she walked out. Saturday afternoon. The sun was breaking through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the cracked asphalt of David's garage. The shop was closed for the weekend. The bay doors were open, letting in the breeze. David was sitting on a plastic crate, watching Chloe ride a beat-up bicycle in tight circles around the empty parking lot. A familiar low rumble vibrated up the street. The black Mantova pulled into the lot, idling perfectly. It didn't sound angry today. It sounded settled. Natalia parked and got out. She wore jeans and a white button-down shirt. She looked 10 years younger than she had on Tuesday. She walked over to David. She didn't have a briefcase. She had a rolled-up tube of thick paper. "You survived," David said, shielding his eyes from the sun to look at her. "I bypassed the sensors," Natalia said with a small smile. "The engine is running perfectly." "Good." Natalia looked at the empty, overgrown dirt lot adjacent to David's garage. It had a "For Sale" sign staked into the weeds. She unrolled the thick paper. It was a blueprint. "I bought the lot this morning," Natalia said, holding the plans out to him. David stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He looked at the blueprint. It showed a massive, modern 4-bay commercial garage, but it wasn't just a repair shop. The plans read, "Apex Logistics Advanced Diagnostic and Training Center." "I fired my VP of Fleet Operations," Natalia said. "I am tired of my mechanics relying on laptops that lie to them. I am tired of replacing parts instead of finding the problem." David looked from the blueprint to Natalia. "What is this?" "This is me paying my retainer," Natalia said. "I am building a training facility. Every mechanic in my fleet will rotate through here for 2 weeks a year to learn how to actually listen to an engine, how to feel compression, how to diagnose a machine without a screen." She pointed to a square on the blueprint labeled Director's Office. "I need someone to write the curriculum, someone to teach them. I'm offering you the contract." David stared at the paper. The salary listed at the bottom of the page was a number that would clear every debt he had in 6 months, put Chloe through college, and leave enough left over to never worry about the rent again. "I run my own shop, Natalia," David said quietly, the weight of the offer pressing on his chest. "I don't wear corporate badges." "I know," she said. "That's why this facility is being built next door. Your shop stays open. You run it exactly how you want. You teach my guys in the afternoons. You don't answer to a board. You don't wear a badge. You just do what you do best." Natalia looked over at Chloe, who had stopped her bike and was waving enthusiastically. Natalia waved back. "You told me you like metal because it has rules," Natalia said, looking back at David. "Because you can fix it." "Well, David, you fixed my car. You fixed my company." She held his gaze, stripping away the armor, leaving only absolute, grounded honesty. "Let me fix this for you." David looked at the blueprint. He looked at the empty lot. He looked at his daughter, bouncing on her bike in her bright purple sneakers, safe and happy in the afternoon sun. He didn't need to check a computer to know what the right move was. The logic was flawless. The physics were sound. David reached out and took the blueprint from her hands. "All right," he said, a slow, genuine smile breaking across his tired face. "But if I'm teaching your guys, I get to pick the coffee." Natalia smiled back. It was a real smile, reaching all the way to her eyes. "Deal." They stood together in the quiet lot, the billionaire and the mechanic, listening to the perfect, steady idle of the V12 engine behind them, ready for the road ahead. When the world insists on overcomplicating the problem, the only real solution is to strip away the noise and get your hands dirty. We spend so much time looking at screens, waiting for systems to tell us what's broken, that we forget how to actually listen. If David and Natalia's story struck a chord with you, if you believe in grit, practical logic, and the undeniable power of human resilience over corporate machinery, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder to trust their instincts, and subscribe for more stories that cut straight to the metal.